Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's here with us today. On behalf of the BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt and the Right Livelihood Foundation, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our event, The Danger of a Single Story, Why Diversity Matters in Politics. I'm Nina Bernarding, Co-Executive Director of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. We are a research, advocacy, and consulting organization that advocates for people-centered foreign policies. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. We assume it's not the first expert discussion or online discussion you're joining via Zoom, so we'll keep it short. The event is a public event. We are recording the session and we will publish it on our website and on our YouTube channel afterwards. In terms of agenda, I will start with a very brief introduction about why we're here. Then we have the opportunity to listen to an amazing panel discussion with our three panelists, which will last around 45 minutes. And then you have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments to the topic for around 30 minutes, and we'll end by 7:30 p.m. If you want to ask questions or comments, you can either drop them in the chat. Alternatively, you can raise your hand and we will give you the opportunity to directly make a statement or ask your question. Please then ensure that you have unmuted yourself and that you let us know who is asking the question or making the comment. So why are we here today? How stories are told, who tells them, when they are told, and how many stories are told are really dependent on power. In her famous 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie highlights the consequences of reducing complex human beings, places, and situations to a single narrative, and highlights how strongly these single stories are interlinked with power. For the last decades, the 5 nuclear weapon states, defined by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, have dominated the international discourse on nuclear disarmament. According to their predominant narrative, international security, or security of states, depends on nuclear deterrence. In this narrative, there was little to no room for talking about the catastrophic humanitarian or ecological consequences of nuclear weapons. This changed with the Humanitarian Initiative, an initiative driven by civil society organizations like ICANN or WILF, and non-nuclear weapon states, which highlighted the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. Emerging from this humanitarian initiative was the momentum for an international treaty banning nuclear weapons, which culminated in the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons by the UN General Assembly in 2017. Thus, the humanitarian initiative is an important example of how a new and diverse set of actors can change political narratives and challenge existing power dynamics. So for these reasons, today, we want to discuss how the Humanitarian Initiative actually managed to disrupt the existing narratives on nuclear disarmament, highlight why we need to diversity in foreign and security policies, and then discuss how we can move forward to a more diverse political processes, but also to a more inclusive understanding of security. We're very grateful for the German Federal Foreign Office for the support of today's event. So before we get started with the real discussion, I just want to briefly introduce our WoX Network, which is a very concrete tool for diversifying foreign and security policy. And for this, I will, hopefully it works now, share my screen with you. Okay. We could not find a woman workshop facilitator with expertise in small arms or light weapons. I didn't have time to properly search for women who can speak on cybersecurity. We needed someone really high level to talk on climate justice. Who hasn't heard these reasons when criticizing an all-men panel at a conference or an all-men expert meeting? This problem, or rather this excuse, was the main reason we, CFFP, started to embark on the journey to create the WoX Network more than a year ago, together with Women in International Security and inspired by the Brussels Binder. After we officially launched it at the Munich Security Conference in February, we are proudly relaunching it today in Berlin and, thanks to COVID, globally. So what exactly is the WoX Network? It is a network of women experts in foreign and security policy, from climate justice to international humanitarian law to maritime security. So everyone who identifies as a woman and is an expert in foreign and security policy can register with WoX and create a public profile indicating their position, affiliation, the sector they work in, as well as how much work experience they have. They can also indicate the skills, such as language skills, or the ability to design and facilitate political processes. Further, they can highlight the areas of expertise, such as conflict prevention, arms control, or natural resource management, as well as the countries or region of expertise. And then anyone who is looking for a woman expert on foreign security who can speak at an event or facilitate a meeting can search WoX and can directly contact the expert without having to register. So WoX is basically a very useful tool for those within foreign and security policy structures that are committed to increase diversity, but also for those who need convincing that diversity matters. Because not finding a woman expert is no excuse anymore. It never was one in the first place. But what exactly, and now we can also prove this. We've opened the WoX Network for registrations almost 8 months ago, and until now, around 800 women have registered from more than 100 countries. This looks like this then. And this is not all. As we will hear later today in our panel discussion, and probably also in the discussion, it is not only important to diversify foreign and security policy spaces, but also to introduce a feminist approach to it. And this is why WoX allows you to search for women experts who apply a gender and/or an intersectional feminist perspective to the work that they are doing. So how does that look in practice? Let me introduce you to 3 experts in our WoX network. Say you need a civil society expert on small arms and light weapons with expertise of working on and in West Africa, who can also facilitate a workshop. WoX will give you the opportunity to contact Ndongo, Donkeng, Armelle, disarmament coordinator at Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Cameroon with more than 20 years of work experience. Or say you need, you're looking for or you need new perspective on cybersecurity and cyber warfare. WoX will suggest you to invite Aisha Kadiri, doctoral candidate at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, who is specialized in cyber warfare and cybersecurity. Or lastly, say you're looking for an outspoken feminist and advocate for human rights who knows German politics inside out. WoX gives you the opportunity to write to Claudia Roth, member of the German Parliament for the Green and the Vice President of the German Parliament. So as you can see, from young academics working on cybersecurity to experienced peace builders and feminist vice presidents of parliaments, they all have registered with WoX. And we could not be prouder to have all of them registered in our network. Needless to say, this would not have happened without the support of our partners and friends who saw the need for WoX, who supported us financially, and who introduced WoX to their colleagues, and who gave us feedback while setting up the website in the first place. We are especially grateful for Women in International Security, the International Civil Society Action Network, the German Federal Foreign Ministry, and the Open Society Foundation, as well as the Right Livelihood Foundation, BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt, and the Munich Security Conference. So what is next? If you identify as a woman and are an expert on foreign and security policy, register with WoX, ideally today. We cannot wait to crack the 1,000. If you are responsible for organizing foreign and security policy conferences, expert briefings, or commissioning studies, you now know where to find your women experts. For everyone else, become a CFFP member and support our work, because together we are unstoppable. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. With us here today is Ambassador Rüdiger Bohn. He is the Deputy Federal Government Commissioner for Disarmament and Arms Control at the German Federal Foreign Ministry. He was previously the Director for Conventional Arms Control in Europe at the German Federal Foreign Office and served as Director for Security Policy, Arms Control in Western Europe and the US at the Federal Chancellery. Welcome and thank you so much for your time today. We also have with us Anurada Damale, or Anu, I tried. She's the UK Director of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. She's also part of the verification and monitoring team at WORTIC, working on solving arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation issues using science, technology, and policy. She's working towards a Korean space policy. Hi, Anu, thank you for being here today. And lastly, we have with us Beatrice Fihn. She's the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning campaign coalition that works to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. She has over a decade of experience in disarmament, diplomacy, and civil society mobilization through her work with ICANN, but also with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Welcome and thank you for being here with us today. So let's get started. Beatrice, I would like to start with you. Your organization, ICAN, you received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for, and I quote, drawing attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and your groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. The humanitarian focus, as it says on your website, has been, since the beginning of ICAN in 2007, an essential focus of the campaign. Why is this the case, and how did you actually manage to put this topic and this focus on the international agenda on nuclear disarmament?
Thank you very much, Nina, and thank you so much for having me here today. I think this is a really, really timely conversation to have, and not just talk about sort of the gender impact, but also reflecting on this year's kind of huge conversation about race and ethnicity, and where we, who gets to speak on this issue, not just in terms of gender, but other things as well. So really in a way that's kind of what the Humanitarian Initiative is about, to include a different type of group of people in the conversation around nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons has always been talked about, and nuclear weapons policies and the solutions around nuclear weapons have been dominated by the nuclear armed states, Euro-Atlantic kind of communities, with a sprinkle in a little bit of Russia and China, maybe India and Pakistan, the other nuclear armed states, and the rest of the world has largely been ignored. And also, what we've noticed that since pretty much the end of the Cold War, when the kind of sort of big anti-nuclear weapons free movement ended, the issue also was sort of disappeared from the public, that the public wasn't involved in this issue very much anymore. And that's really what we wanted to change, and basically trying to take an approach that looked at nuclear weapons not for what we hope they will do, or what we wish they will do, or what we write in theory, but what they really are in reality. So taking a realistic view of nuclear weapons. This is what they are, and this is what they do to people. And what we also, and one of the things that we've talked about a lot in ICAN, is to kind of center this issue around the real experts on nuclear weapons, the survivors of nuclear detonations. It's the people that know how it looks like when a nuclear bomb goes off, how it feels like, what your family members look like when they're dying from the impact of nuclear weapons, how the heat blast feels like, how the flash feels like. They are the ones who know the most about nuclear weapons, not people sitting in very comfortable offices on the other side of the world. So basically, this has really been to also look at the practicalities of nuclear weapons, like what happens after a nuclear bomb goes off. And I think that a lot of the way we talk about and the stories we tell about nuclear weapons is about the run-up to how will it play out, almost like a computer simulation, like up until somebody pushes the button. We have this kind of image, and when we talk about it, like how do we get someone to not use nuclear weapons? But we never really talk about what happens afterwards. Even in military exercises, very often it ends after using nuclear weapons. They can do all this military simulation, but after, okay, this will lead to that, will lead to that, and that will lead to nuclear use, and then the simulation ends. Don't actually simulate what happens afterward. How do we help people? What do we do with the fires? What do we do with the radiation sickness? How do we create infrastructure to help the survivors and victims? So really, that was basically the starting point, to change the perspective, to open up for a new kind of conversation, and also to take this issue away from the security policy crowd and look at perhaps the people that would be directly impacted, the public, of course, but also emergency responders. What does the healthcare sector think about this? What does the humanitarian relief agencies think about this? What would they do in terms of responding to a nuclear detonation? And that really helped to bring a different perspective that is very needed, because they are the ones who are actually going to do something afterwards. It is not the think tanks in Washington that are going to go and help people after a nuclear war happens. It is the emergency response teams around the world that are going to try to do something. So their perspective have to be a part of the policy conversations. And through that, we had 3 large conferences organized by governments the first one by the Norwegian government, the second one by Mexico, and the third one by Austria, which really looked into the kind of different perspectives on that and bringing those kind of different voices and different practical considerations that you have to think about if nuclear weapons are used into the conversation. And that stimulated this whole new conversation, and that led to getting governments to agree to negotiate a treaty banning nuclear weapons. So by really diversifying the kind of conversation and shifting the perspective, we had a huge success in coming up with a new type of policy option that hadn't been done before in the nuclear weapons field. And I think that really shows how we, broadening the conversation is not just to be nice. We're not including more women or other regions of the world just to be nice. It's also because that's actually leads to different kind of solutions, and solutions that work for everyone, not just a very small group of people or countries.
Thank you so much. And I really like that you pointed out that you're looking at it from a realistic perspective, and that you are actually the realist here, and you look at what's happening if there is an accident or if it will be used. And because I'm sure you've heard a lot that you're an idealist, and yeah, everyone would agree with that, but yeah.
Can I just add something? I actually had a conversation with, because obviously that's something we hear a lot, like, oh, you're being unrealistic, you're being naive and idealistic. But I had a conversation with a former NATO high-level official in NATO, and I was talking about him. But what happens when something goes wrong? Like the day that something, inevitably, if we keep nuclear weapons forever, one day they will be used. You cannot walk around like threatening to use this forever and ever and ever. It's one day they will be used. What happens then? And he just like sat back and said, "Nah, I don't think that will happen." And provide zero evidence, right? And zero arguments, or just like, I don't think that will happen. And yet somehow in our perspective on what's rational and realistic and strong, that is a lot stronger than, UN agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, 122 governments, like outlining how they have no response capacity, no nothing. I don't think it will happen, somehow is portrayed in our society as the kind of rational answer. And it also shows the kind of the gendered and sort of this like the kind of white Western male kind of expert always gets the kind of benefit of doubt in these kind of conversations, and their views always seems as more rational than, say, a woman from a civil society organization in an African country, for example. And it's just like the way we kind of weigh the expertise really changes. Because if I would say, yeah, I don't think that will happen, nobody would take me seriously. But somehow that's acceptable for a certain group of people.
Yeah, and also if you don't work towards a certain goal, then you will never get there. If the answer is always that's the way that it always has been, and that's the only way that works and is rational, then we're not going to get anywhere. So yeah, thank you. I would like to switch to Anu, and just playing a bit devil's advocate here. I mean, everyone really knows that nuclear weapons can have detrimental humanitarian and ecological consequences. But why was it so important that in 2010, at the NPT review conference, the states, including the nuclear weapon states, expressed at least concern that there are humanitarian consequences that could happen? Why was that such a breakthrough?
So firstly, thanks so much for having me. Congratulations on the launch. I remember when this was conceived of, and it's a great idea, and I'm so pleased that I get to be a part of it. Secondly, I try really hard not to use technical language and try and be accessible with it. So if I do say something that sounds a bit academic, sorry about it in advance, just ask what it means later, and I'd be more than happy to clear it out. So first of all, the 2010 review conference was in my memory, which is far shorter than that of anyone else on this call, was the first time that there was some uniformity on the matter of, how extreme the consequences of nuclear weapons are. Now, the agreement was probably on different levels, be that a face value sort of level of just a statement, or we as a country are actively making this part of our foreign policy and have dedicated resources towards this. But it was enough social and political capital or power to push for the Humanitarian Conference as an initiative to be a global thing, in which, of course, ICANN played and continue to play a huge and significant role. Also, I actually, when you were introducing the question, does everyone know how impactful nuclear weapons actually can be? I don't think they do. I think that more and more people are finding out now that more and more people are talking about it because of things like the Humanitarian Initiative and the Nuclear Ban Treaty. I think it's become, documentaries like Chernobyl, however much, truth there was to it, you can go in circles about that argument, or plays that I've been to on the impact of nuclear weapons. I think it's very easy for us from where we're sat to say, everyone knows this, but I don't think they do. And I think if they did, and it actually became part of, a greater dialogue within general society and not protected knowledge, which is something I'll come back to later, I think it would probably help the conversation a little bit more. Coming back to what we were talking about, I think where the issue arises with the term breakthrough is the consistency in which breakthrough means, right? Because it isn't the same for everyone. It's not the same for every country. It's not the same for every individual. As people on this call know, but maybe not everyone knows, the history of nuclear weapon ownership and what it has meant when it started and even now has led to normative and structural power that lead to clubs almost. And again, this idea of an old boys club, a protected club like war, comes from these masculine, and I wouldn't say male, it's a masculine norms. And the formation of these clubs could be unintentional or intentional. It's up for debate, right? But we still refer to the countries that have nuclear weapons as nuclear weapon states in all kinds of international relations and foreign policy dialogue, whether it be to do with nuclear weapons or not. It reinforces this idea of like this impenetrable group of countries who just so happen to be great powers or almost great powers, and just so happen to sit on the UN Security Council as permanent members. And these are institutional and entrenched incentives for the possession of nuclear arsenals that can only be outbid for. So there's this thing called technological lock-in, right? You as a country, whether it be a war technology or an energy technology, because of the use of it and what it's meant to you historically, lock into this technology, and you can only break it by a bigger or shinier armament incentive. And that would be called technological displacement, or by a huge amount of social, economic, political capital applied at a lot of different levels. And I think that this was such a breakthrough, not because of the statement itself, I don't think so. I think it's because of the impact it had and the outcomes it had, that being the Humanitarian Initiative in a large part, and the work that ICANN have done. And I remember when I was writing my dissertation, it was just after ICANN, my master's dissertation, it was just after ICANN had won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work on this. And I was writing my dissertation on state dependencies on nuclear technologies, basically, and looking at civil, military, and medical uses. And I remember reading a paper by Nick Ritchie, who did a great piece on the reframing of nuclear debate. And it's really accessible read. So if you're interested, just Google Nick Ritchie and reframing nuclear. And it was from taking it from this idea of national security to international security, which is absurd in the first place. You're not going to use a nuclear weapon on yourself. It's all about the relationship with other countries. So why it was framed as national security in the first place personally blows my mind. And also international security and safety, taking it away from the country to the individual. And that was done, through the lens of the work of the Humanitarian Initiative. And there's this notion called punctuated equilibrium in science policy. And it's this change that happens to the accepted equilibrium. So in this case, it's this vague notion that it's fine for countries to have nuclear weapons as long as they vaguely follow the rules and don't mess around too much, and don't use them, obviously. But by applying enough pressure through different means to change it, you create this tipping point. And in this case, the ban treaty and the dialogue surrounding it is that tipping point. It's the equilibrium being punctuated. And the Humanitarian Initiative, included state actors, non-state actors, grassroots level people, political people, religious people, academics, scientists, actors that have firsthand seen what a nuclear strike can do, as Beatrice outlined, from all over the world, not just from the global north or the west. And it's interacting with this like international system of innovation within security. And it moves away from this siloed, again, masculine idea of nuclear weapons being siloed away from every other part of the economy and society. And because of that, because it's engaging with adjacent and auxiliary areas, it's influencing this international system of innovation at every level. And I'm an advocate for systems theory. This is something I'm very interested in. And if you want to see whether it's working or not, well, look at the US urging allies literally yesterday or this morning to pull out from backing the ban treaty, at the same time as backing this thing called Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, or the CEND. And writing joint letters with other nuclear armed states when it was conceived, dismissing its role in disarmament. And I think that is why this breakthrough is important, because it's been sustained over time. It has meant different things to different people and reframed the argument to make it more uncomfortable for those in power. And without that level of uncomfortableness, you're not going to have the change.
Thank you. I really like this term, uncomfortable for people in power. I think that is something very important for all the time when we talk about feminist approach to foreign and security policy. And I think it's also very important that you pointed out that although it was agreed on in 2010, that doesn't mean that everyone is all the time will agree to this, and that it means the same for everyone. And I think, I mean, both of you probably, and also Mr. Bohn, I think all of you know that it's something that will always come up in all the review conferences, and that needs to be defended probably at every new conference. And Ambassador Bohn, I would like you to reflect as a representative of Germany, a state which does not have its own nuclear weapons, but who hosts nuclear weapons. How did Germany perceive this change in international discourse, and this breakthrough, as we just talked about it? And how do you perceive the situation at the moment, now 10 years after this change?
Yeah, first of all, many thanks to the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for the presentation of the WoX network. WoX has proven to be a very useful tool to avoid menace at foreign and security policy events. And I'm happy to participate today in today's launch event. And I would like to encourage further WoX registrations. Germany highly welcomed when President Obama in his famous Prague speech outlined his vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. And we strongly supported the conclusions of the New START Treaty that continued the steady process of bringing down nuclear arsenals from their peak in the 1980s. We should not overlook that the Russians and the Americans managed to bring down their arsenals by 90% if we take the Cold War arsenals as a yardstick. And we shared the enthusiasm then of the international community about the NPT action plan adopted at the review conference in 2010. The rise of the Humanitarian Initiative, I believe, had a lot to do with the disappointment that followed afterwards. The ambitious set of goals set in 2010 was very insufficiently implemented. The failure of the 2015 review conference was a sobering moment, a great disenchantment to all of us. Today, nuclear disarmament has come to a standstill, new tensions have arisen, and technological developments have increased the risk of inadvertent escalation. And I think it was against all these trends that the Humanitarian Initiative got traction, leading to the negotiation of the TPNW. Let me stress that we entirely share the concerns underlying this evolution. And let me also underline that we share and have always supported the goal of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. For many years, we have been underpinning that commitment by concrete political and diplomatic action. Against this background, the new discourse, as you call it, is a mixed blessing. Personally, I find the polarization over the TPNW a bit unfortunate. Yes, there are different opinions among advocates for nuclear disarmament. It is not a secret that we believe that a treaty that does not engage any nuclear weapon states will not bring us closer to a world without nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. But why emphasizing what divides us? Let us concentrate on what unites us. That is the common goal, I think, and jointly promote progress on nuclear disarmament. The Stockholm Initiative for nuclear disarmament is an excellent example in this regard. It comprises both supporters and skeptics of the TPNW and unites in their resolve to push nuclear weapon states to live up to their responsibilities and take concrete further steps like the full transparency on their arsenals, and we want the nuclear weapon states to show more restraint in their doctrines, to reduce escalation risk by confidence building measures, to ratify the CTBT, of course, to extend New START and to build on it, and to seek more stockpile reductions, etc., etc. So there's a lot that we can do and achieve in the shorter term, and this is actually the focus of the German government's policy in the nuclear field. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe I just add my next question to you right there, because you've talked about the polarization between those who are supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and those who don't. And I mean, Beatrice, you know this better, but I think it's about to enter into force. They're missing 3 ratifications. But there's an imbalance. The majority of those that are supporting it are non-nuclear weapon countries from the Global South. But in particular Europe, there's a lack of support from nuclear weapon states. And what is your take on this? Why is this the case?
Can you please repeat the last part of your question? It was acoustically difficult to understand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Why do you think so many countries from the Global South are supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, where they are, in contrast, in Europe, the non-nuclear weapon states are not so supportive of the treaty? Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, I think clearly countries in the Global South, for instance, are in a completely different situation. They are not basing their security on nuclear deterrence, so it's easy for them to join or support the TPNW, whereas countries in Europe, unfortunately, still have to base their security on nuclear deterrence. They are, in a way, exposed to nuclear threats, and therefore it's much more difficult for them to follow this avenue of the TPNW. They have to stick to nuclear deterrence.
Beatrice, do you want to comment on this?
I do. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the ambassador is, correct in terms of it's countries in the Global South, for example, and it's not just countries in the Global South. There are some European states. We have 3 of the 47 countries that have ratified that are in the European Union, for example. And a couple of more signatures as well, I think, from Europe. But what really is the key is that, and this is also about language, right? How do we talk about this weapon? What was it? Like, I would say that it's countries that do not believe that threatening to mass murder civilians with weapons of mass destruction is okay, that have an easier time joining this treaty, and countries that believe that it's okay to threaten to mass murder civilians with weapons of mass destruction have not joined this treaty. And I think that that's really, I like to kind of swap deterrence, because again, this is about language, right? When we talk about deterrence, it sounds very rational and sort of, it's a theory, it's a security policy, but it's really threatening to use weapons of mass destruction. And these weapons are not meant for like military targets. They are meant to wipe out whole cities, cause unspeakable harm to civilians. So I think it's just, I like to kind of use that as a term, because I can tell when I use it, representatives from these governments, in conversation, they're like, well, that's not actually what it, but I mean, yes, it kind of is in the end, that is what it is, like that's the policy, but we cover it in these sterile words rather than talking about actually what it means. What does it mean to believe in nuclear deterrence? It means that you believe in like the idea of threatening to wipe out whole cities as a way of ensuring your security. And I think it's also important to
remember that when we talk about that there are different security concerns, I'm not sure there are. I wouldn't say that countries in, say, the Middle East or in Africa or Latin America and the Pacific have different security threats. A country like, for example, say, you know, Marshall Islands or Tuvalu, who just ratified the treaty last week, is literally an existential threat right now. It is drowning these countries. They are about to not exist anymore. They have huge security threats. And I think that it's just a matter of also how you look at it, and whose security threat gets to be prioritized and gets to be seen as more, you know, important than others. And I think that's where we see kind of connections also to this issue, and say things like police violence, which has been a big issue this year. You know, when this kind of like this is for your security, but it actually harms people. But the people in power say, no, this is a security issue. Like, this is for your security. But they're talking about their own security and their own power and their own status in a system, rather than actual true security. I mean, more than 200,000 Americans have died from COVID. People don't have access to healthcare, for example. Isn't that a security threat, for example? Isn't that a huge security concern? And I know that you can say, well, it's a different thing and stuff like that. But it also gets to be who gets to talk about what security matters and which security. Is it, you know, women that are being abused in their households? You know, we know that societies with more weapons, for example, where there's a heavy flow, like a large flow of weapons, you know, women are much more exposed to armed violence, for example. So arms trade, for example, is connected to people's actual security. And I think that that's really important. So when we talk about, you know, we have a security policy on nuclear deterrence, I think it's important to admit what that means, and that security policy means that you're prepared to violate the laws of war and target civilians in warfare. And that there is no kind of different security concerns. Every country has unique security concerns, and it's not an excuse to have nuclear weapons. We wouldn't say that a country like Iran, for example, that feels like it's being threatened, maybe, they think that they have a huge security concern. Does that mean that they should have nuclear weapons the way that Germany relies on nuclear weapons? Obviously not. So I think it's very important that we don't sort of claim that certain countries' security is more important than others. And a final point, so I'm going on now, but a final point is also what's really important for the countries that do rely on threatening to mass murder civilians with weapons of mass destruction is that their protection actually threatens these other countries. So Germany has this addresses its security concern by risking other countries' security. If there's nuclear war, it's not just going to be the countries that are the kind of target for the detonation that is harmed. It's going to spread to other countries. And that's why countries like Austria, for example, very close to Germany, is like, we don't, you know, if Germany gets nuked, it's going to impact Austria. They're not going to be able to protect their people. So it's not just a German security concern, it's actually an Austrian security concern. For example, for countries in Africa, if there's nuclear war between India and Pakistan, it was hugely tense these last years between these countries. Global crops could be reduced with 20% over the next decade. And that would have enormous starvation, enormous food scarcity all over the world. Infrastructure can break down. That means that these two leaders of these two states impacts directly the security concerns of Western. So it's a security also at the expense. These countries, these around 35, 40 countries that rely on threatening to mass murder civilians as a security policy, they are actually reducing the security of other countries, and they have a right to address those countries.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. And I think it's really important that we get down to the discussion, whose security do we actually talk about? And as you said, who is defining what we mean by security? And Anu, I know that at WCAPS, that is the heart of your work. You work to promote the perspectives of women of color on peace and security, but you also work, and I think mainly in the US, but I assume also in the UK, on redefining national security. Why are you doing this? How are these goals interlinked? And Ambassador Bohn, I saw that you want to get in on this, maybe after Anu, then yeah.
So I want to begin by saying I agree that again, like, this is why when people talk about nuclear weapons as national security, it baffles me. Like, what do you mean? Are you not considering the impact that this is going to have on other countries? Do you think that a nuclear weapon will say, oh, here's a geographical boundary, I'll stop polluting, I'll stop bombing, I'll stop having remedial effects? That's not how it works. That's not how nuclear weapons work. And to pretend that they do work that way is in my view, coping mechanism for these countries to deal with the fact that their primary mode of taking care of their country is to, as Beatrice has so well put, mass murder civilians. And so I just want to get that out of the way to begin with. Now, coming back to WCAPs, yes, so WCAP started in the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, to be clear, started in the United States, and it was launched by Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. And this year we decided that we wanted to roll it out to the UK and Europe. The reason being that the context of security concerns and peace concerns and minoritization and marginalization are different in Europe than they are to the US. And it's really, really important to recognize that marginalization is not homogenous everywhere. It's not the same for everyone, just like security concerns aren't the same for everyone. And so we decided to bring it to the UK, and it's now rolling out across Africa and Europe. So it's really great to see more and more people engaging. So the idea is it's championed by women of color and non-binary people of color, but it is to promote essentially minority views on peace and security and to redefine national security. And you could argue in the first instant that actually actively including the views of minorities in peace and security is redefining national security for obvious reasons. But let's go into it a little bit. So I don't mean, and I want to again get this out of the way because it's a pet peeve and is becoming one more and more. I'm not saying those groups that say, I hear you, I hear your concerns, and then continuing as is, because that's frustrating. It's emotional labor for minorities to have to deal with that, and to be expected to play that role, be that women who are championing certain aspects of security or challenging aspects of security, or be that Black people that had to speak up and explain to their white friends why BLM or Black Lives Matter was important. I'm personally done with that, and with institutions and organizations that think of diversity as an endpoint or a goal to achieve, because it's not. It's a process. It's a process of continually challenging and holding to account systems that exist to make them better for everyone. You have to recognize, in order to actually commit yourself to this, you have to recognize the value of having a representative, fair, equitable decision-making forum to form security policy or any policy for everyone, and recognize that this is the only way to move past policy failures of the past that exist, that have led to a world within which every sector is treated as global and interrelated, and yet we still treat security as it exists within a closed box in its own silo. And nuclear security in particular, I think that dialogue is changing more and more as we talk more about emerging technologies. But again, it's more in relation to nuclear weapons and how they interlink with that. Now, gender specifically, the core of the general gender equality debate is the acknowledgement that women and non-binary people have the right to engage with and critique matters that affect them, which I would say is a pretty basic human thing to do. Apparently, some people don't. There is also plenty of evidence from many sectors that demonstrate that diverse and inclusive teams encourage innovation and lend themselves to being more proactive in problem solving. But I think at this point, while those things are important, because sometimes, when policymakers want to make change, you have to give them the whole policy analysis and say, well, look at this, this is what's going to happen for you. Just be inclusive, because our society is diverse and made up a lot of different people. So there is a clear recognition of the importance to bring women to the table, especially as new problems in the international security field are arising. So the fact is that the threats that are facing humanity are varying in how they are being delivered and how they are impacting society. And so having the same people at the table or in the room is no longer acceptable. And I think coronavirus is a live example of that. We didn't know how it was going to impact us. We didn't know, and we weren't prepared for the aftermath of it, which is why it's had such a discriminatory effect among people. It's not the great equalizer. I'm tired of hearing that. It's really not. The people at the table should, by logic, be able to provide a variety in the solutions and the instruments that are suggested to deal with these threats. And that variety cannot be provided by a small faction of society who, largely speaking, have had similar experiences in life. And no university degree, no amount of, being part of esteemed boards or organizations is a replacement for human experience. It just isn't. And the fields we have worked in are filled with people that have very deep, specific knowledge, and they treat that knowledge as really protected, and it belongs to them, and they are the expert in this, and they have to be the ones that people go to. And that disencourages engagement from new individuals and encourages sticking to the status quo. And that has snowballed. And the absence of largely speaking senior white men at discussions on gender mean that gender discussions can often be treated as something that is sort of on the sidelines or tolerated, rather than a core part of decision-making and strategy. And, events like these, I'm glad that we have a man on the panel, because it's important for them to be engaged in this dialogue, and they do engage. Now, the wonderful thing about WCAPS is that we recognize that gender should be a substantive talking point going forward. It should be a core part of the talking and the discussion, starting from recruitment organizations to negotiations of international treaties. It's all along all of the processes and all of the institutions that are associated with international security. But also, we recognize that this means not treating all women and non-binary people as one homogenous community. And that's not true. There is a wealth of diversity within just women, all with a wealth of perspectives and experiences that will only contribute to the cause. And I urge everyone that's listening here today to consider making gendered approaches ones that are intersectional. So people of color, LGBTQ people of different religious backgrounds, that's a big one that's often overlooked. People from different countries or different socioeconomic backgrounds, these are all barriers to access to this field. I personally, if you asked me at school, I went to I don't know if this means anything to anyone on this call, but I went to a state school in a very poor part of London. If someone told me I'd be doing this today, I'd laugh in their face. There is only one way that we can actually truly diversify that the international security plays, and it's by actually taking intersectional approaches. And that means, and I'll come back to this later on because I know what the third question is, but actually taking steps that mean something. Specifically now, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, for instance, which is still going on, by the way, it doesn't stop just because everyone's bored of it. It's important to recognize that race is always important in breaking down normative spaces. Security isn't just having nuclear weapons. It's, as Beatrice pointed out, it's policing, it's pandemics, and a nation is defined by their citizens, I would say. And if we disregard personal security, then there's nothing to talk about in national security, because without your citizens being healthy and functional and serving your society, you don't have a functional nation, you have a failed state. And that's why inclusion and redefining national security or international security are linked, in my view.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you also for pointing out this hierarchization of knowledge, that if you went to an important or a known university, not an important one, that's, my language is also biased, obviously, but to a well-known university, and it matters so much more than your lived experience. And I think that is a very important point that you're making, and that we should take into account. And also that yes, obviously it's a human rights issue that we are able to participate in all the processes that impact our lives. But it's also a matter of making good policies, because we will not be able to make a policy that works for everyone if we exclude more than half of the population. So Ambassador Bohn, I would like to give you the opportunity to respond to the various points that Beatrice and Arno made before we move on to our last part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, I would like to briefly respond and touch upon some points that especially Beatrice Fihn made. First, there was this issue that also some European countries are supporting the TPNW, not just the Global South. And of course, these European countries are, of course, West European countries. There are, whether they like it or not, also protected by what we call the NATO umbrella. So it's of course easy then to argue against nuclear deterrence. But again, I think these countries are in a very particular situation. With regard, I felt that Beatrice Fihn touched a little bit on this very complicated issue of the legitimacy of nuclear weapons. And here I simply think that a weapon as such cannot be illegitimate. For instance, police forces also have guns. They need guns to protect citizens from criminals who also have guns. So it depends who are the good ones and who are the bad ones. And of course, me as a German diplomat, I say that we, together with our NATO partners, are the good ones. And to give you 2 examples, it is often overlooked today that there is a big discrepancy if it comes to nuclear weapons between NATO countries and Russia. There is kind of a parity if it comes to strategic nuclear weapons, which are the big the big ICBMs and other city-busting weapons. And then we have the non-strategic weapons that are sometimes also called battlefield weapons. And in this field, there's a huge discrepancy. Russia has now around 2,000 of these nuclear weapons, whereas there's almost nothing in Western Europe. And we live with this disparity because the Cold War is over and things have, of course, changed politically, but still it's a threat. And currently Russia is increasing its arsenal, which is of course worrying. You of course heard of the end of the INF treaty that was caused by a Russian violation, and NATO reacted not by mirroring the Russian behavior and by deploying new missiles and whatsoever, but NATO said that they would simply not deploy any kind of nuclear missiles in Western Europe as a response to the Russian action. And I think I would also like to point to the fact that the so-called Russia-NATO Founding Act contains an important provision that says that NATO is not allowed to deploy any kind of nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe. And of course, we comply to this provision. Whereas Russia deploys in our neighborhood in Kaliningrad and so on nuclear-capable missiles. So it's often forgotten that there is a real threat, there is a real disparity in Europe that we somehow have to react to. Although the Cold War is over, and we hope that also the Russians will move forward and overcome their Cold War thinking if it comes to nuclear deterrence, nuclear balance, parities, disparities, and so on. Yeah, that's it for the moment.
Okay. Beatrice, do you want to respond to that really quick? No? Okay, I feel like we are already very late in the discussion, and I feel like there's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to just talking about the nuclear disarmament field. So actually, I would like to close the panel discussion for now here and see if there are any questions, and we can always come back if there aren't. But so the floor is yours, participants, and if there are any questions, please drop it in the chat or also just raise your hands, and then we can give you the floor. Otherwise, I have tons of questions, so we can continue the discussion. Okay, there is a question. Lydia.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
You hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the webinar, and also I would like to thank Mrs. Beatrice Fihn for talking about the victims and the survivors and the emergency response during like the catastrophes, because I would like to know how how do we talk and how do we try to talk about the survivors? How do we try to involve the victims of nuclear weapons, because in a certain way, for example, let's say the natural resources that are used to build up the weapons are taken from African countries, let's say DRC Congo, for example, Mali, where there is a lot of uranium and stuff like that. And people there are really suffering from this industry. So how do you work to involve these people, to give them voice so that they can speak for themselves, for the wars that have been going on in their countries and that are really also killing mostly women and children? And so, yeah, that's my question. How do you, in your organizations, speak up to these, speak up for these people? And yeah, so yeah, and thank you so much for thinking about the emergency responses and the humanitarian responses, because it's a major issue. Thank you.
Beatrice, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really one of the things that we're trying to do, to lift, the consequences of this weapon, because it's very easy to talk about it in such a sterile way, about these missiles here, these missiles there, and it's the strategic balance. But there are real people suffering right now, and not just from 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but ongoing environmental and humanitarian harm in the nuclear test site, and of course also sites where the production of nuclear weapons is happening, like uranium mining. In one way that we're trying to work with this is to also make sure that survivors are treated as experts, that their stories and their knowledge is valued as essential for us to understand the policy work that we're trying to do, that is the basis of it. We've worked with survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from nuclear test sites in Marshall Islands, in Australia and Algeria, Kazakhstan, and just talking about these also like colonies, right? Communities of color, indigenous communities, people that did not have a voice in the political processes to decide to use these weapons. And what we know from those sites as well is that while, of course, a nuclear detonation harms everyone immediately, the long-term impact, not just the way that war disproportionately affects women, for example, much more in general sense, but also radiation, for example, significantly harms women in a different way than men, much more cancers, birth defects. We see women in Pacific Islands, for example, having problems with miscarriages, stillborn babies, same thing at nuclear test sites, and certain also uranium mining areas where there's huge problems. So, we've tried to also make sure that these communities are involved in the advocacy as well. They're not just, it's not just like trauma porn, when we just take them and share their stories and then we go and do the work, but as active participants in the campaign, at the United Nations. But one of the challenges of that is also to create a sense where communities from such diverse region can have a voice and be able to articulate that in a way that works for them as well. That it's not just taking people from the Marshall Islands and putting them in a conference room where we want to negotiate a treaty, but that actually the stuff that we do is adjusted to also the communities that we're trying to address the problem for. So it's a lot of work in that, and work that needs to be navigated very, very carefully and very inclusive. But I think it's definitely important, and I think that's really important when we talk about how nuclear weapons have kept the peace, is something people say a lot, since 1945, to look at these communities where people are suffering and being harmed. And that, again, back to this analogy with police brutality, the thing that protects, that the state says this is for protection, is actually ending up harming people. And it's usually people that don't have enough representation in political forums and are not taken seriously, and their harm is not, seen or heard by people. So I think that's extremely important, and something that we As we go to the implementation of this treaty, when it enters into force, there are legal obligations to work on victim assistance and environmental remediation under this treaty, and something that we are committed to working with governments to actually have a concrete impact on the ground in these places, and involve the communities and make sure that the communities that have been harmed by nuclear weapons are able to be a part of that process.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think that's obviously working for CFFP. That's also one of the one of our guiding principles, that we should always try nothing about them without them, so that we cannot talk about people, but we need to talk with them, and also reflect on our own position of power, and sometimes also just not speak, I would say. There's a great question which just fits really nicely to your answer just now, is how do we make the perspectives visible of those who are marginalized and who do not have the power to organize? Because I mean, as we've heard, civil society is the driver for social change, but it also depends on having resources and having the knowledge to advocate for change. So I would like to ask both Ambassador Bohn and Anu what you think of how we can make sure that also those who do not have the resources can be heard and are included. Ambassador Bohn, do you want to go first?
Yeah, regarding the question, how can we protect also marginalized groups from, for instance, also nuclear testing? I mean, the good news is that there is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT. The treaty is not in force, but most countries of the world are a party to this treaty, and the norm of not testing nuclear weapons has become kind of a de facto norm without this treaty being in force, which is great. And I think this is also kind of a protection of each and everybody on this planet, that further tests will hopefully not be conducted. The last test was conducted by North Korea, I think some 10 years ago. And of course, we cannot be sure whether there will be another test, but today the situation is completely different from the time when the first nuclear weapons were built or developed. Today, the world knows much more about the catastrophic consequences also of testing nuclear weapons, because at the beginning, not only civilians that were in the region were killed or suffered by nuclear testing, also the nuclear powers, by testing their weapons, sacrificed their own soldiers because they were too close to the explosion sites. So many things have changed since that, and Germany is actively supporting the coming into force of the CTBT. We are currently holding, together with Algeria, the so-called Article 14 a chairmanship of the CTBT, which is about advocating for the signing and ratifying of the treaty in order to bring the treaty into force. Thank you.
Thank you also for pointing out that international norms also do work, even if there is no treaty so much. But I do want to get back on the question, because it was not so much on protecting people, but it was on how we can include civil society, and especially movements that cannot organize. So can you talk about how Germany, for example, makes sure that in the countries where there are German embassies, for example, how's the engagement between the German embassies and civil society, for example?
Yeah, the German government is, I think, a front runner if it comes to including also civil society, non-state actors, non-governmental organizations into disarmament and arms controls projects and discussions. There are a number of conferences that we organize also this year in November, for instance, 6th of November, on the future of arms control, disarmament, where we, of course, deliberately include representatives of civil society, of industries, not exactly of marginalized groups, but kind of multi-stakeholders into discussions on how to make this planet safer. In more concrete terms, if I can turn away a little bit from the nuclear field to the conventional field, we make lots of efforts to help people in a number of regions of this world to bring down the level of small arms and light weapons that are floating around in some countries after civil wars and so on. And there, all the projects actually are based on including any kinds of groups, also marginalized groups, men, women, in order to make sure that we can really advance this issue of getting rid of redundant small arms and light weapons and making these regions, mostly civil war regions, safer.
Great, yeah, and hopefully also our WoX network, which I mean you are supporting, will also contribute to that. Anu, I would also like you to answer on the question, in particular about the movements. I would say not so much the organized civil society, but how can we include also those who do not have the resources to organize themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this question, it's layered, and it kind of covers a lot of different things. So there's the practical aspect of, like, in the short term, how do we make sure those that don't have a platform, essentially, or an effective platform, can be provided a platform? But also, it's not just what we put out there. It's about how to make ourselves more accessible to these people, right? So it's about how to change what our field looks like, or our fields look like, to actually make them more accessible to more people. So there's several things here. The first is, I think putting in resources to promoting networks that already exist, like WoX, like WCAPS, like Women in International Security or Out in International Security. These organizations exist, but because there are so many, and there are quite fragmented ones, and there are ones that are national, ones that are international, I think, and one of the things that I'm interested in working on is creating, a central hub for all of these places to live, to be able to provide platforms and networks to those who are, not in a position to be able to do things on their own. I certainly wasn't 2 years ago. If it wasn't for, WCAPS and the internet and me being shameless on Twitter, I probably wouldn't have been able to form the network that I have now. And I think that, I was lucky that I was proactive, but not everyone is, and not everyone can afford to be proactive, because of, the ways that they've been educated, or the ways that they've been brought up, or the school they went to, or, where they lived. Geographic disparity is a big thing. Seeing WCAPS roll out to Ghana is a huge thing for us, to roll it out to Africa and then see it spread out through from there, see it spread east, through France. We're hoping to see, something happen in Germany, so on and so forth, and move further east. And I think geographic, like we say, we live in an interconnected world, and we do. And I think it's really important to recognize that the internet has played a huge part in facilitating accessibility and discussion, but actually physically putting things and organizations into those countries to allow, or into those protected communities, or into those religious communities, to allow for the context of those communities to be accounted for, is really important. But basically, we just need to shout about what already exists and make it adaptable for other networks. And then on the flip side, I really think that the way this field is perceived is a massive barrier to accessibility, a huge one. Years and years ago, gentlemen were allowed to have developed weapons in war, and now we've ended up in a situation where a certain type of person can hold a certain position because they look a certain way, because they went to a certain university. Whereas the other people, or like certain countries, are allowed to have nuclear weapons, and it's sort of acceptable, and we kind of talk about it, and other countries that have them are the baddies, and it's like, what are they going to do? And I think it's really time for us to stop hanging on we're all guilty of this. We're all guilty of going to roundtables and theorizing and going around in circles and being like, well, I think this and I think that. And what there really needs to happen is concrete change on these barriers to accessibility. For instance, the way this field presents itself, it's acceptable to women who have this girl power or burnout attitude, and it makes it really accessible. When actually, when you look at workplaces, such as my own, such as Vertic, shout out, that, you know, have things in place like flexible working hours, like extended leave for parents and support for them, it makes it easier for more people to view themselves in those positions. You know, when I first started thinking about working in this field, I was like, can I commit myself, like so many people in this field look like they do, to not sleeping, not having a massive social life outside of my job, and seeing people on social media or openly talk about the fact that they do have a family and they spend time with them and they do have friends and hobbies outside of this field has been massively helpful. The lack of role models, visible role models that come from different parts of life, and I think networks like WoX and WCAPS are a really, really good way of doing that. I don't think representation is the end goal. I don't think just seeing someone is always, but it's helpful. It is helpful to see someone that looks like you and has a similar experience to you. It makes you feel more comfortable. But yeah, I think supporting vital institutions that exist, that are working to make this field more accessible, is really important. Promoting mentorship networks that actually are not based in London or in DC or in Berlin, but actually, you know, can be, you know, we have the internet now. I think there's something to be said for in-person networking, and I think mobilizing university networks is a really good way to do that, and getting universities to host things, because universities exist in different towns sometimes. But it's again, like, it's all about promoting these spaces and also fighting this idea that a safe space is something that is to be ridiculed. It's not. It's a space for people that are not used to being in a very perceived high-paced, dynamic environment, to actually develop skills that they need to be able to go into those environments. And yeah, so I think skills development is another one, and that basically promoting these networks that exist and pushing them out geographically is the way to go, because I think that would help break down the barriers in as well. But yeah,
and I think it's also important that you highlight also our homework, so the homework of civil society, that we actively reach out to each other, and that we actively build networks and connect. And I want to stay on this accessibility point a bit, if there are no other questions at the moment, because Beatrice, you talked about in the beginning already a bit about the language, and we talked about the important states who haven't joined the Benn Treaty, but also I think on your Instagram account, I can also highlighted a couple of problematic phrases, and one of them was also the responsible nuclear weapons. And you've argued that it's very important to think about how we talk about it, because not only about the narratives, but also by not using inclusive and reflective language, obviously we reinforcing racist and sexist hierarchies. So how do we change this, and how do we move forward?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is really fascinating to see also sort of society evolving and changing. I was watching actually Friends the other day, the TV show, and was like, whoa, that is so problematic. And this is like, you know, in the 90s, and I you know, how much has happened in terms of how we speak and what do we express and what's acceptable. Jokes that were fine to like a decade ago is like, or 2 years ago, it's not okay anymore, and it's like constant evolving. So, you know, I don't talk about these things to kind of shame people for saying it. Like I'm working on these things, and there are things that I'm saying that are very problematic constantly, and it's part of a process, right? But I think that in terms of, you know, we've started to think about how we talk. You know, Me Too, for example, was a huge movement and it wasn't the beginning of a feminist movement and sort of a thing, and it's not the end. It was just like kind of a trigger moment, in the same way as Black Lives Matter, for example, this spring. It wasn't the beginning, absolutely not. I mean, the civil rights movements and anti-racism has gone on, you know, ending slavery, that kind of stuff, long time ago. And it's not going to end. It was just a moment where it kind of leveled up in the public mindset. And I think we need to use those moments. And now for nuclear weapons, we're talking about similar things as well. And it's all connected. So things like calling them nuclear powers, like, attributing power and value to them in the way we talk about. Like Anya was talking about, like the P5, using the words P5 when we talk about the nuclear weapon states. I mean, no matter what you think about the ban treaty, whatever, like, there will be a day where the P5 will not be nuclear armed if they implement the legal obligations on the NPT. They won't, or there will be an expansion of the permanent states. So the P5 and nuclear armed states is not the same thing. I intentionally don't even say nuclear weapon states, I say nuclear armed states, because there's no difference between the UK and DPRK's nuclear, like there's no, they are nuclear armed. There aren't some better nuclear armed states or worse nuclear armed states. I mean, there's one nuclear armed state that have used nuclear weapons. I would say that's the worst nuclear armed states, and all the other 8 are, I guess, more responsible, but not really. But so I think it's really important to kind of challenge ourselves in the way we talk. To say that no important states hasn't sort of joined this treaty, or only non-important states, it kind of showcased that you value certain countries much more. And I think it's really important to call that out and to question yourself when you say that. And, who gets to be a realist? I mean, I think it's all like language is so important. And I really kind of enjoy playing around with that sometimes in conversations with kind of military, kind of this traditional security expert, to like compliment them on their passion. I like to say, like, wow, you're very passionate about this, and I appreciate your like very sort of emotional and passionate, comments about nuclear weapons. You can see their heads like, what? Why is she calling like my very rational theories passionate and emotional? You can kind of use it the other way as well. So I think it's important to see it not as people have said something. We use words because that's how we grow up. But the world is changing constantly, and we need to constantly keep checking ourselves and how do we frame this, who gets to be prioritized in the way we shape this issue. And it sort of to come back to the kind of humanitarian initiative, like how we talk about nuclear weapons is really, really important. And I can notice a huge difference if I start a conversation with talking about strategic balance between the US and Russia, or NATO and Russia, or if I talk about the burn injuries, the melting of people, the cancers of children, the miscarriages that women have. It sets the tone and it shapes the conversation completely different. And that's really powerful. Language and the words we use and the perspective that we approach an issue is extremely important. And I think that the biggest challenge that we have in nuclear weapons policy and to get to nuclear disarmament is not the actual weapons, it's the mindset around nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I think it's important that you also highlight that it's a process, and that we constantly need to unlearn. I mean, it happened to me today in our discussion that it slipped in again, and it will continue to happen. So I think it's very important that we also don't disencourage people to reflect and to become better, because it's just we grew up in a racist and sexist world, and we actively have to unlearn. Mm-hmm. Ambassador Bohn, do you want to comment on some of the things that have been said, or?
Yeah, only very briefly. I fully agree that the realities change and the language changes as well. I fully understand that a word like deterrence sounds outdated today. Why? Because the Cold War is over. It's actually Cold War language. Deterrence, mutual destruction, and whatsoever. And I think most people see it like this, that these things are outdated because there is any longer the threat perception that people in Europe, for instance, had during the Cold War. Today, people have completely different priorities. If you look at public discussions, we see that especially young people focus very much on climate issues, migration issues, gender equality, and so on, which is of course important. But I think it's also important not to forget that we still live in a world that is not entirely peaceful. And as long as there is a threat, we somehow need to protect against this threat and discourage others to use terrible weapons. And maybe someday this word deterrence will be replaced by a word that sounds a little bit better, but the reality is that we still have to protect ourselves.
Anna, you directly want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think Ambassador Bohn has raised a really, really interesting point, which is something that I've come up against a lot, and I think a lot of people that I think as a product of this field, determined to call people next gen or young gen, or, have forced this division. I've been to so many roundtables where people are like, well, young people just want us all to drop our nuclear weapons immediately, and it's unreasonable. And, you know, it can't happen. There's, you know, I work for a verification think tank. I understand that nuclear weapons can't just be dropped. You have to go through a whole step of technically disarming and then disarming the actual economy. And I think a lot of young people have that understanding, and there needs to be a conversation that exists where we can actually openly talk about the fact that young people are really interested in the disarmament dialogue. Why? Because we think there are more important things to worry about, like climate change, things that actually do matter. And actually, nuclear disarmament and climate change are linked. They are connected issues, and we need to talk about that more, not least because the civil and nuclear, civil and military nuclear complexes are like inherently interlinked, like shamelessly so in some countries. The other thing is, yes, you know, the word deterrence, fine, you know, is outdated, but it's also kind of inaccurate when countries are actively making more usable or low yield nuclear weapons part of their priority. The whole point of deterrence is that you're not going to use it, but it's a way to make sure that other countries don't attack you. By saying that you're making something low yield or more usable, attaching an intention to it and saying, you know, if there is a critical, no country that I'm pointing at, but if a country says in their posture very clearly that, it, you know, we as a country, if there's a critical national infrastructure attack, we are okay to use these low yield, casual, day-to-day nuclear weapons, then they're no longer a deterrent. They're just not. And calling it a nuclear deterrent is just inaccurate. So I think thinking about what deterrence is and whether we need to actually stop using the word nuclear deterrent and talking about it as a nuclear arsenal straight away is one thing. And the second thing is understanding that young people do actually have an understanding that disarmament isn't something that's going to happen overnight. We're not asking for zero immediately. We're asking for the process to actually feasibly begin in the right direction and steps to be taken, rather than people kind of teetering around and almost kind of easing in the other direction. So I just think those 2 points are really important to raise at this point and in this discussion, because, you know, again, like the gendered element of using the words, you know, emotional for disarmament and everything also apply to young people, saying, you know, that they just want things to happen. Again, it's an intersectional approach. You'll meet plenty of young people that go to universities in Europe that are firmly in the deterrence camp and firmly in what they call the realist camp. And I've come across many. And so again, it's not homogenous, it's across society. And I think having a combination rather than just young gen, next gen events and panels, which are just, you know, older people or more experienced people, is one of the reasons why there's this misunderstanding. You need to have more people around the table that come from different experiences, which is kind of what's happening here. Yeah, that's my 2 pence that I wanted to add.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that you point out that people who are advocating for the treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons, I mean, we do see that it's a process, but we also believe that because the systems are created by humans, by men mostly, but this means also they can change. They're not just given. They can change, and this is why we need to work towards changing them. Yeah, so Bea, you want to come in? Yeah.
All right, I know we're running out of it. It's just a really interesting conversation, right? And I think that one of the things that I'm trying to kind of really, think about in this work is that if everyone agrees, then it's probably not changing anything. Right? Like if there's always like an inherent power dynamics where the people in power do not like to give up power. I mean, that's just natural human nature, and that's the way it is, which means that challenging that power will always be controversial. And sometimes, you know, in certain days when I just feel very depressed about the world and I was like, this is too hard, this issue, I want to work on saving cute little kittens and nobody is against that and nobody thinks that's controversial and that's much easier, but it doesn't change the world either, right? So I think that there's the friction when you demand change is always going to be uncomfortable. And it's always going to be provocative. And I think that this, you know, one of the frustrations of working with diplomats is, of course, that the whole purpose of diplomats is to come to an agreement, whereas the purpose of creating change is to have this friction. So there's a, you know, sometimes also when, and I find this is a problem for civil society that works very closely with diplomats, is that we lose focus on that because we work so closely with the diplomats whose main job is to come to an agreement, and that's a natural, you know, that's what they're supposed to do, right? That's their job. But the kind of, you know, to also embrace a little bit that there is no meaningful change that isn't, or meaningful sort of change of power dynamics that isn't painful. And we see that on gender equality, we see that on racism, we see that on age, you know, ageism, or, you know, all of these kind of scenario or situations where there is a group of people in power and another group that is challenging that. It is friction and it's painful and it's always going to be discounted, like not now. I always come back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s Birmingham letters of the real enemy is the ones that agree with you, but say not now, not in this way and not like that, because it's never going to be comfortable. And when it comes to nuclear disarmament, there's never, and we saw that at the end of the Cold War, right? We had some good years at the end of the Cold War. It didn't happen. Nuclear disarmament in that way. And it's because there will always be another excuse. And I think the UK government is like, well, we can't get rid of nuclear weapons because we don't know what the security situation will be like in 100 years. It's like, well, who knows? When will you know what it's going to look like in the future? You never know, right? This is sort of this kind of like, there will always be excuses. It's a bit like stopping smoking, right? They will always be like, well, not now, I'm on holiday, not now because I'm so stressed at work. Like there has to be this kind of external outside push and a challenge where continuing as normal is no longer an option. And that's what happens on gender issues. That's what happened on anti-racism movements right now. That's what we're orchestrating on nuclear weapons, that there's like confrontation. And that's very difficult for people in power, and they are not going to like it. And I think that from our side, it's just something that you have to kind of see through and come out on the other side of.
Yes, yes. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I feel like we could have gone on much longer, but I want to give the panelists the opportunity to say a last sentence or a statement. You don't have to, but just in case you want to come in one more time. Ambassador Bohn, is there anything you would like to close with?
Yeah, referring to the last remarks by Bea, I would say maybe our world today is not more confrontational than in the past, but of course today we have completely different kinds of media that we can use, social media, and I think that is the reason why many of these confrontations come up to the surface. So it's also a question of communication, and yeah, I am still optimistic. To end on a positive note, I'm still optimistic that we will make progress in the field of nuclear disarmament. Maybe you've heard that 2 days ago, Russia and the US apparently came close to an agreement to prolong the New START Treaty and to discuss a cap for all other nuclear warheads. I mean, it's not complete disarmament, but I think it's a first step. So this is something that makes me optimistic, and I hope for more in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on a positive note. I think that's very important after talking about such an issue. Anu, is there anything you want to close with?
I just want to say that we need to put our best foot forward right now, right? So it doesn't matter where the best idea comes from. But clearly the best ideas don't exist already in this field. So we really need to just best idea wins should be the way forward. And to allow for that to happen, we need to diversify the field. So yeah, that's all I'll say. Thank you.
So we all know what we have to do. Beatrice, one last sentence?
I'm fine.
Okay. Then it's just up to me to say thank you for all of you for joining this discussion, and particularly to our panelists who we're willing to have this not so easy conversation, and also with disagreements. So I very much appreciate it. And I think if we don't have these conversations, then we're not going to move forward. So thank you so much to all of you, and have a lovely evening or day